A very warm welcome to everyone here to EFTA House, especially to those attending in person, and a friendly hello to all our virtual participants for the second Swiss breakfast this year. And today we will be discussing trade and sustainable development. My name is Alexander Rengli. I'm the Deputy Head of Mission at the Swiss Mission to the EU. According to the program, Ambassador Rita Adam would have been welcoming you today, but given the fact that we have a Swiss delegation here in Brussels today, I am jumping in. Another change which we will be having is that our panelist, Christina Bende, as it happens these days due to an unfortunate chain of events, won't be here with us at the beginning. Her flight is delayed, but we're still hoping that she might be able to join us later for the Q&A session. But we have an excellent replacement, Karin Büchel, Head of Division for Free Trade Agreements and EFTA at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, will be joining us virtually in a moment. So we are really truly having a hybrid event, which is excellent. Sustainability provisions in free trade agreements have become significantly more important in recent years. Together with other EFTA states, Switzerland revised its chapter on sustainability provisions in 2020, with new provisions on environment, gender, and labor, as well as a strengthened monitoring and implementation system. Just last week, the EU has published its revised trade and sustainability approach in free trade agreements, covering relevant aspects of implementing and enforcing trade and sustainable development chapters in EU trade agreements. So today's event is indeed very timely, and I'm absolutely delighted that we are also joined by Dora Correa, Head of the Directorate at DG Trade, which looks after, among other topics, sustainable development. Some of the questions we would like to discuss at today's event are: how do the Swiss and EU approaches address sustainability issues in trade agreements? Is cooperation the right approach, or should there be more assertive enforcement? Are free trade agreements even the right place to address sustainability issues? I'm very much looking forward to listening to what our distinguished experts have to say on these and other questions, as well as to the discussion with the audience. I will now give the floor to János Amann from Euractiv, who will moderate our Swiss breakfast. And before I step down, I would also like to invite all our online participants to actively participate in the discussion. Use the hashtag Swiss breakfast and follow the Swiss Mission account, Swiss Mission EU. Please enjoy the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Renkli. Good morning, everybody, whether you're here enjoying a nice breakfast or joining us virtually. My name is János Amann. I am the economy editor at Euractiv and author of the weekly economic policy newsletter, The Economy Brief. And it is my pleasure to guide us through this morning. And I'm very glad to be joined by two distinguished officials here and to help us understand where we are standing on TSD at the moment. So as Mr. Renkli already said, we have here with us Dora Correa from DG Trade, Director at DG Trade, and joining virtually Karin Büchel from the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs. Before we begin, just a quick word about the program. We will start with introductory remarks by you and also by Ms. Büchel. And then we will have a guided discussion of about 20 minutes. And then we will really have the entire second half of the event will be to discuss with you, with the people here present, and also virtually. And especially the people virtually, I encourage you to use the Slido option to also ask questions that we can then bring up to the officials here. And to start using this platform, I'd encourage you to all start with a little survey to get us all started with this. I encourage also the people in the room to use this QR code there to answer this little warm-up question. It's a quite fundamental one. What is the relationship between trade and sustainability? The first option is trade is about prosperity, which in turn is important for sustainable development. And it has risen there in a neck-to-neck race with trade agreements should be instruments to foster sustainable development. So they should be, but maybe they are not automatically. And the last option, a laggard as of now, is that global trade exhausts finite resources and is incompatible with sustainability. So we do not have that many participants yet. Now it's starting. Okay, we have a critical voice down there. That is okay. Thank you very much. I will let you try this out, and we see already a bit which numbers are or which answers are preferred here in the room, but also virtually. So I would like, with this in mind, with this little introduction in mind, I would like to give you, Ms. Correa, the word to start your introductory remarks about the EU's new approach on SDD.
Thank you very much, Janusz, and good morning to all. Many thanks for the invitation to be here, which is extremely timely because the European Commission just reviewed its approach to trade and sustainability last week. So this is a great opportunity for us also to test the approach we are putting forward and also have your feedback and your views. And as you can see from the results of the poll, there are very contrasted views around the trade and sustainability. And the difficulty, of course, has been to listen to all these different views and then try to strike a balance in the approach we are putting forward. And before maybe I go into what are the elements of this approach, which I will try to do in 5 minutes, so that's my challenge for the morning. I would just like to make two prior remarks, also to set a little bit the context for what we are doing in terms of the TSD review. First of all, just recall that the EU trade policy is based on 3 pillars: sustainability, openness, and assertiveness. And these 3 pillars are, let's say, cross-cutting to everything we do. So when we work on sustainability, we have to bear in mind that we have an open trade policy and also an assertive trade policy where the EU can use other ways to assert its interests. So that is the first remark. The second remark, and it also actually joins one of the questions at the beginning, of course, we strongly believe that our trade agreements can make a contribution to more sustainability, but trade agreements are one of our tools in our toolbox. So, of course, it's not a question of solving all issues around sustainability through trade agreements, but rather to enhance and maximize the contribution that these agreements can make to sustainability. So those were a little bit the 2 comments I would like to make to set a little bit the context. Now, on our review of the TSD approach, first of all, let me start by saying that the communication that the Commission adopted last week, the power of trade partnerships together for green and just economic growth, is the result of a very long consultation period, over a year. A consultation period where not only we listened to all the different stakeholders in the process, but also where we've carried out a very in-depth study of approaches to trade and sustainability worldwide to try to learn from the best practices. After having listened to everybody, and as we could see the different contrasting views around, the Commission tried to strike the right balance and come with an ambitious approach across 6 different areas. And now I'll be looking a little bit to my script to make sure I don't forget any of them. So first of all, of course, we continue our approach to trade and sustainability based on global international standards, i.e. The multilateral environmental agreements, the ILO conventions. So the standards which we share with international partners and which makes our approach credible, sound, and non-discriminatory. This is a very important point. And in a way protects against accusations of protectionism, for example. That is the first principle, I would say. Secondly, the communication also advocates a strong tailor-made approach. It's not a one-size-fits-all. We trade with very different countries across the world, and the objective is to identify for each country specific implementation plans, roadmaps with concrete actions, milestones if need be, when we are negotiating with these countries. Thirdly, and this is a very important point, the idea is to mainstream sustainability across the whole of the FTA, of the Free Trade Agreement. So it's not only the TSD chapter, but seeing also how we can enhance sustainability across the whole agreement. And this can be, for example, by liberalizing green goods and services as a priority. So that's a very strong point. Fourthly, we believe in the transparent and collective monitoring of how these commitments, the bilateral commitments to trade and sustainability, are being implemented in the context of the agreement. Now, this means, of course, that we will pull together within the Commission the expertise from different services, also from our delegations on the ground, but we'll also work with member states in capitals, on the ground, and of course with European Parliament in monitoring the implementation of sustainability commitments. And of course we will also be including civil society, and this brings me to the fifth point. Civil society will have a very important role to play in the whole life cycle of the agreements, and also of course in the monitoring of the implementation of sustainability commitments. This, for example, means that we are proposing to strengthen the functioning of the domestic advisory groups and also increase the transparency in terms of the composition of these groups. And we are also revising the, sorry, it's going to be a bit technical now, but we're also revising the operating guidelines for the single entry points under the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer, to facilitate access to the single entry point for TSD issues. Thanks for bearing with me. I'm now coming to my last and sixth point, which is, of course, enhancing enforcement. Going back to the three pillars of openness and assertiveness, as you know, the revised approach to trade and sustainable development includes very much stress on enhancing compliance and enforcement, including by using trade sanctions as a last resort. And this is really a measure of how we want to, let's say, send a strong message in terms of the need to implement core TSD commitments. Now, I stress again, this is the last resort, and our default modus operandi with our partners will always be engagement and dialogue, and I go back to the openness pillar. So that's that giant step forward in terms of improving the compliance aspect of our TSD part of the agreements. So it is a sort of a holistic policy mix, which we hope will improve the implementation of sustainability commitments, and which we hope that ultimately will help us reactivate our bilateral trade agenda. Because trade agreements can only contribute to sustainability if they are in force. And that is now clearly our priority. And I don't need to stress that this is all the more important, of course, in the current geopolitical and geoeconomic context, where we need to diversify our sources of supply and increase the resilience of our value chains by diminishing certain risky dependencies. I'll stop here, and I very much look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Correia. I would now give the floor immediately to Karin Büchel. I remind you she leads the Division of Free Trade Agreements and EFTA at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO. Ms. Büchel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for having me and for this spontaneous invitation to speak today or to participate today at the panel. It's a bit annoying, I hear myself, but I will manage. Okay, so we don't really have a very new approach when it comes to TSD, but it's continuously evolving. We have started to include thank you. We have started to include substantial provisions on trade and sustainable development, or a chapter on trade and sustainable development back in 2010. And since then, we have included such provisions systematically in all our new agreements and also in our modernized agreements. Our approach is basically a European approach. When we came up with our model chapter, we have been inspired by what the EU does, but we do normally have a bit of a lighter institutional structure. But it is quite inspired by the EU and quite similar, I would say. As I said, we don't really have a new approach, but it's regularly being updated, and so we have had a review of the whole chapter just recently in 2020, where we have added a number of substantial provisions. And we've also reinforced the dispute settlement provisions, and we enforced the stakeholder engagement. So when it comes to the new provisions that we have added, we have in particular added provisions on climate change, biological diversity, and sustainable agriculture and food systems, among others. What we have also done is we have strengthened the enforcement provisions. As you know, we do rely on the cooperative approach, like we do not foresee sanctions, but we do include the dispute settlement chapter. I mean, the TSD chapter is subject to the dispute settlements chapter, with the exception of arbitration. So if there is a problem, we would first foresee consultations in a joint committee, and then consultations under the dispute settlement chapter would be possible, but no further actions could be taken. So what we did recently is we strengthened this. We added the possibility of the panel of experts. So if a problem persists after exhaustive consultations, then there would be the possibility to foresee a panel of experts. So that is quite new. We have so far not yet included this in an agreement, but we will hopefully soon be able to do that. Finally, what we have also introduced is a provision regarding stakeholder participation, where we have included an obligation for the parties to provide their stakeholders with an opportunity to share comments and make recommendations to governments on the implementation of the chapter. So that is what we have done regarding the model chapter. We believe that we actually have a very good legal basis with this revised approach. And in addition to that, we have also recently worked on improving the monitoring and the implementation of this chapter. The implementation is, as for the other parts of the agreement, done via the joint committee, and that continues to be the case also for the TSD chapter. But what we have done recently is we have kind of come up with a more institutionalized approach. So we continuously gather information on implementation issues in partner countries, and we maintain up-to-date country profiles. Before a joint committee meeting, we then ask also for specific input from our civil society, but also from experts in member states, the EFTA states embassies in the partner countries, and the EFTA advisory bodies. And that the information that we gather then that will be used for the discussion in the joint committee meeting. Finally, a last point on my side on something that is a bit new on our side is that we are looking into conducting sustainability impact assessments. Switzerland has already done such an assessment for Mercosur. We've commissioned an environmental study. But now we have had discussions together with the other EFTA states to do a more comprehensive ex-ante study on a case-by-case basis. And we will launch such a first project now with Thailand, where we have just or are just starting negotiations this week. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Büchel, for these comments, for these very enlightening introductory remarks. I would like to pose my first question to you, Ms. Correa. And I mean, when I saw this, the new approach on TSD by the EU Commission, of course, as a journalist, you go on the most juiciest thing, it's the sanctions possibility. And so I was wondering what was the reasoning behind moving towards this, let's call it a more robust enforcement of TSD, and how important is the new possibility of imposing sanctions really? Is that just something you have also to please the sensationality of us journalists? So what is the importance behind it?
As much as I respect journalists, that wasn't the prime intention. No, and going back to my introductory remark is really, as I said, finding that right balance between the three, openness, sustainability, and assertiveness. Now, as a journalist, you go straight for the chase. As a bureaucrat, I take a step back. So let me first, before going into sanctions, talk about the compliance in general. Because what we are doing is, in fact, we are adding to the TSD compliance mechanism we had in our agreements, we're adding a new compliance phase. We're basically aligning the dispute settlement with the state-to-state dispute settlement that we have traditionally in our free trade agreements by adding to the specific sustainability phase. So basically, when you get to the stage where, following a complaint, you have the independent panel, which is kept issuing a report. In our old agreements, the compliance stage for TSD stops there. What we are doing is adding a compliance phase, which is consonant to what we do in our standard dispute settlement, whereby, let's say, the losing party will be asked to take remedial action following the report. Now, this will be a first step into the compliance, and then, only if that is not done, and if the losing party does not take this remedial action, then we would move for sanctions on two particular issues. And now you really need to see what are the sanctionable elements. And here the reasoning is, again, to go back to international standards, international commitments, and the sanctionable elements are very much linked to violations, material breaches of the Paris Agreement and violations of ILO core principles. So what I mean is that the compliance and the enforcement has different stages, and sanctions is really the last resort. And why do we limit the sanctionable elements to these two? It's a question of proportionality, because the sanction will be, in fact, withdrawal of trade preferences, which is quite a heavy-handed mechanism. And to do that, we have to consider elements which are very strong international commitments of the parties, Paris Agreement and ILO core principles, and which are very precisely defined and monitored by the Paris Agreement mechanisms and the ILO, so that we have a very objective way of monitoring these, whether there are material breaches or not. So, I understand why you go directly to the sanctions, but the compliance is a little bit more complex. And why are we doing this? I think it's also to, first of all, show that this approach is credible, that this approach has teeth, and also to, in a way, address those who are concerned that in our dialogue with our partners, we would tend to privilege the openness to the assertiveness on the sustainability part of the agreements. So that's, I think, to achieve what we intended from the start, i.e. a balance between the different objectives.
Okay, thanks. It's a pity that we are not that important, but I would like to pose the same kind of question to Ms. Büchel. As far as I understand, Switzerland and the EFTA more generally does not envisage the same kind or a similar kind of enforcement mechanism. What is the reasoning? What is your reasoning for how best to make sure that the TSD commitments are actually kept?
Thank you. Well, as I explained before, we have just recently updated our chapter, and where we have actually included another level of enforcement. I mean, we do believe that issues in the TSD area are best resolved actually through cooperation and consultation. That's why we do still heavily rely on those kind of consultations in the joint committee, but also in the dispute settlement chapter if necessary. What we have added recently is the possibility to have a panel of experts. So that is quite new. I mean, we first need to gather a few experiences with that. I mean, to be honest, we have never had an issue in the area of trade and sustainable development. I mean, our experience is already more than 10 years old, and so far we have never had an issue that would actually, where we would have thought, oh, we'd love to have the possibility for sanctions. No, not really. But we will, of course, continuously monitor disagreements or these chapters, as I explained before, and take this up in the joint committee. And should we see the need for more action, then we would have the possibility for a panel of experts. For us, the question of sanctions is not relevant at this moment, I think, because we have just recently included this, and we first need to have some experiences with that. We, of course, follow with great interest what is happening in the EU. We have also followed the case that the EU has had under a panel of experts with Korea. And for us, it's quite reassuring to see that this procedure actually works.
Thank you very much. I would like, before I open the floor to the questions that the audience might have, I would also like to know, I mean, we are on the last meters at EU level for an agreement with New Zealand, maybe, hopefully. Yeah, I was wondering, did you achieve to already include this new approach there? And could you give us any news on that?
Well, the New Zealand Prime Minister is in town today, and she will be meeting with the President of the Commission, so I wouldn't want to anticipate the results of that discussion. Of course, with New Zealand, we are very much dealing with the like-minded countries in many sustainability issues. So my estimate, my anticipation is that on that front, this could be even considered a first test case for this approach. And you know, again, I was crossing my fingers. I'm optimistic that we will have an announcement later on. Although you know, the last mile is always the hardest. So let's see how it goes.
Okay, thank you very much. I would now like to open the floor to also questions that you might have. Is there anybody who already wants to take a word? So there is a question. Okay, we have a question there. I haven't seen it. Sorry. Yeah.
Good morning, Eleonora Catella with Business Europe. Thanks a lot for organizing this event, and thanks to Ms. Correa for all the remarks and explanation, detailed explanation on the new approach of the EU. May I praise the Commission on what seems to be a really good review of the system, and a lot of good proposals are in the communication. May I say, however, that this is a communication, so we'll have to see how this gets translated into practice. So do I understand that we have to wait for the New Zealand text to be published at some point to see how they get translated into practice, these provisions? We remain with a lot of questions on, for example, sanctions. Business Europe, in its contribution to the public consultation, had raised a few on, for example, what shape they would take. You mentioned withdrawal of trade preferences. Would that be for an entire type of goods, for example, at first time violation, or second, or is it going to be incremental, a bit as we see in other agreements, for example, the USMCA? And so that's a question on sanctions, and another question is on this idea of mainstreaming sustainability across the agreement. You mentioned the possibility of liberalizing green goods as a priority. Of course, this would be submitted to agreement on this point with the trading partner. And would you also check with the trading partner the possibility for green procurement, for example? Is that another example of how sustainability could be mainstreamed? Is this being considered? Thank you.
Should we do one-to-one? Or
yes, I think one-to-one would be good, yeah.
So on the first point, on the sanctions, and I understand this is really attracting lots of attention, but let me start by saying that, again, sanctions are a very last resort. And as we have heard from Karin Büchel, the dialogue actually works. And the Korean example is a telling example how dialogue works. So to get to sanctions, you would have to exhaust lots of phases before you get there. Now, in terms of what the sanctions would be, the idea, of course, is that they would need to be proportionate, and they would need to be, let's say, using the methods we have for the moment in terms of assessing the value of the sanctions, the duration of the sanctions relative to the breach. So it's very difficult to give you now in theory what that could be, because it would need to be based on a case-by-case analysis and very much relative to the nature and the extent of the breach. That is why it's so important for us that the sanctionable elements are very much linked to international standards, where we have very precise and quantified even commitments, and where we have monitoring systems and reporting systems already in place. That is really a fundamental point for us to assess whether there are breaches or not. So as I say, it's very difficult now to say how much will be the sanctions and the duration of the sanctions, because it will need to be really a case-by-case analysis of the breach in question. And as I say, it will need to take into account the previous phases of dialogue. It will need to take into account the report of the panel of experts. So it's again very difficult to give you an all-encompassing answer. On the mainstreaming, green procurement, yes, why not? This is something we could also consider in the dialogue with the partner country. What is important also to say, the idea is that, and this is the country-specific approach I was talking about at the beginning. The idea is that we open a very intense dialogue with all stakeholders, including, of course, Business Europe, from civil society, even when we start considering and scoping the agreements. So the idea is that we conduct a gap analysis in terms of our ex-ante impact assessments, sustainability impact assessments, and we then gather contributions in terms of what should be the implementation priorities for each country. So in that context, in the context of these contributions, you'll have an opportunity to say what you think, not only, of course, in terms of TSD commitments, but also in terms of the mainstreaming of those commitments into the FTA. And green procurement may make sense for certain partners, but not others. That's why it's so important to have these country-specific roadmaps. And this is something that you could perfectly include as a priority in these country-specific roadmaps.
Thank you very much. I see a question online from Michel Lobé for Ms. Büchel. And she touches upon a topic that brings us a little away of the whole sanctions discussion and towards a very interesting example of how Switzerland actually tries to implement sustainability into its trade agreements. So the question is, for Karin Büchel, could you please tell us more about the palm oil solution with Indonesia? And I would like just to add upon that, maybe you could also elaborate whether this solution could be used for other solutions, for other products, industries, or trade partners.
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, as some of you may know, the agreement with Indonesia has been subject to a public vote in Switzerland, and it was approved with a rather narrow majority. So this agreement has been quite intensely discussed, more than any FTA before in Switzerland. The public discussion circled around palm oil, actually. So the public discussion really focused on this one issue, namely what conditions we're granting to Indonesia on palm oil. So what we have done in this agreement is, in addition to a comprehensive TSD chapter based on the EFTA model provisions, we have added another provision to address concerns regarding palm oil production. So we have added an article on the sustainable management of the vegetable oil sector with specific commitments and action points regarding non-deforestation, the protection of peatlands, and so on. And for the very first time in the Swiss Free Trade Agreement, we have actually linked this provision to the concessions granted on palm oil. So that means that Indonesian palm oil can only benefit from the preferential market access under the agreement with Indonesia if the importer proves that it has been produced sustainably. So what we have done in addition to this internally is we've done a kind of a benchmarking study of existing voluntary sustainability standards for palm oil, and we now accept the strictest of those standards as sufficient proof that the palm oil is actually sustainably produced. Now to the question if this can be a solution for further agreements or further products. I mean, this innovation has created many expectations on the part of civil society in Switzerland, of course. And we are ready to examine whether such an approach can be replicated in other negotiations. It is not, however, as easy as it sounds. It cannot be always done. I mean, a few issues need to be a few things need to be fulfilled in order for such a solution to make sense. First, you need a product that is particularly sensitive, like palm oil. Then you need an MFN tariff that is quite high or high enough to create an incentive. And then Switzerland must be able to offer a substantial concession. And as you might know, we are quite defensive on the agricultural side, so we're not always able to offer a concession. And lastly, there need to be credible and well-established international certification systems that we can rely on. So if all these issues are fulfilled, we are, of course, ready to examine this on a case-by-case basis for further agreements. But as I said, it's not as simple as it might sound. Thank you.
Thanks. So there are quite a lot of criteria, actually, that make this work in this specific case. I would like to come back to the civil society side of things later, but I have seen that Cristina Bende has joined us after she was so cruelly let down by her airline. So it's very nice that you came here. You came here from Thailand, as I understand, and I was wondering whether you would want to make a couple of remarks, because also in the negotiations with Thailand, I think you have TSD approaches in it. Would you want to give us a couple of words on that?
Yes, thank you. So it's Lufthansa, not my airline, because
Okay,
I'm a public, you know. I mean, but I would be intrigued to hear the response from the private sector afterwards, because we are hearing about international standards. But I can give you a little recap of what we experienced during the first 2 days of negotiations, because I left before the end. But I could follow the discussions on trade and sustainable development. I think Ms. Bücher gave you the full picture of what EFTA wants to put in the agreement in terms of trade and sustainable development. And now I can tell you what Thailand replied to this first presentation by EFTA. They fear already disputes. So they are willing to even add other topics such as fisheries and not only aquaculture, as according to the FAO definition, we of course focused on aquaculture. So they are even coming with more ideas in cooperation and in avenues for enhancing the SDG agenda. But then again, they ask, what is it about, what is it not sanctions? What is it about disputes? How do you imagine disputes? And honestly, on the EFTA level, we fail to explain this, because we have never, whether it is in the TSD chapter or in the whole of the agreement, which also contains arbitration, used the dispute settlement. So at least from the EFTA side, we fail to give an example. We just say we never use it. And whether this will convince Thailand to enter into a very innovative and cooperative chapter, as it is in its core, is still to be seen. So that's what I can tell you from a first discussion that happened during 5 hours this week. And my question would be about international standards, which of course the EU as well as all EFTA states, and especially Switzerland now mentioned for the palm oil discussion. What is the industry doing? You know, how is the industry working? Because basically this palm oil solution came also in collaboration with the private sector. The public sector doesn't invent. Those are not standards which are legally binding. So what is how can we collaborate more?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Would you maybe just want to react on this? Like, how do you collaborate with the private sector in these kinds of instances, or to find these standards? Is there a way you collaborate with the private sector?
Well, as I said, the idea is to have an ongoing dialogue with all stakeholders, private sector, civil society, social partners, in the whole life cycle of the agreement, from its scoping, the ex-ante impact assessment, the sustainability impact assessment, and then the definition for roadmaps and sustainability commitments. So this dialogue is ongoing, in addition, of course, to the dialogue with the country itself. Let's not forget that, because you know the FTAs are indeed a platform for dialogue and engagement with these countries. Of course, then again, this also goes back to a point I made at the beginning. The FTAs, our agreements, are but one of the tools we have in our toolbox. And of course, you all know that the EU is also taking autonomous measures on certain issues, and including on deforestation. And this is another tool that we have at our disposal, which of course applies in an equal manner to all our partners. So that's a bit of maybe of another level, let's say, of enforcement, of policy setting. But the idea is that all these different instruments come together to push for more sustainability. So that's maybe a little bit a difference with the EFTA / Swiss approach.
Okay. I've seen we had a question here in front. Lady with the green.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. My name is Nusha Virczurek, Deputy Head of the Mission of Liechtenstein, and thank you first to our Swiss colleagues for the kind invitation to this breakfast, which is not only rich in culinary terms, but even more so in content. So thank you for the contributions from everyone. I'm afraid I will be getting back to the sanctions topic. Of course, you mentioned the incremental approach to compliance, and also how that is to ensure proportionality, also in terms of which standards will be applied. But I mean, I think there is a possibility that the prospect of possible sanctions could have an impact on the willingness of trade partners to undertake binding commitments. So how would the EU envisage to encounter such a possible dynamic? Thank you.
It's a very important point, and these were very lengthy discussions in the process of deciding to go for sanctions, and in the process of defining what would be sanctionable elements. The point you're making is a point of negotiability, of course. We need to be able to engage with our partners, and we need to be able to keep them interested in having agreements with us. This is why, in the end, we have gone for sanctionable elements, which are, in fact, already international agreed standards, i.e. we are not imposing anything new on our partners. The partners we trade with are partners who have agreed to the Paris Agreement and are partners who have signed to the ILO core labor principles. So it's a question of, and of course it's a reciprocal engagement. We ourselves are engaged to that. So that is why we have decided to go for these two pillars of international standards. And there were discussions, of course, why these international agreements and not others? Let me give you an example. Why not the Convention on Biodiversity, for example? And in the end, if you look at the communication, you'll see that indeed there is a very strong commitment to biodiversity as a sustainability commitment, but it's not part of the sanctionable elements for a very simple reason, that the Convention on Biodiversity is still not, I would say, as precise and as quantified in its commitment, the contracting parties' commitments, as the Paris Agreement or the ILO conventions, and it doesn't have the same sort of monitoring and reporting system. Because what is important here is that it shouldn't be the EU telling to a country, you're not enforcing this, so we're knocking you on the head. No, there is an internationally vetted mechanism to monitor compliance. Yeah. And if you look at the communication on, for example, on biodiversity, we have what we call a bridging clause saying, let's see what the next conference of the parties will produce on biodiversity to see if indeed we could consider later on integrating this. But for the moment, it's not yet as ripe as the others. So we need to be careful in what we put in the sanctionable elements. First of all, that these are international standards that our partners already share and have committed to, on the one hand. And secondly, that they are monitored and easily reported on by, I would say, international impartial sources, to put it like that. So that's a little bit how we have come to these two elements.
Thank you very much. There was one more in the middle here.
Nicolas Potier from Bruegel. Mike, to play the devil's advocate here for a moment, we didn't have a terrible success signing FTAs, often because of these sustainability issues. So my question is, how do we manage expectations? In Europe, having to ratify it through a lot of countries, in Switzerland having gone through a referendum, do people have the right expectations? Could we end up in a world where we don't have FTAs with the sustainability contracts, we don't have FTAs at all, we also don't resolve our not sustainability issues?
I would like to add to this question one of the questions that we have online by Robert Francis, and he asks, what if a trading partner doesn't want these chapters? What if they reject the provisions altogether? I mean, maybe with New Zealand, it's like-minded partners. Maybe if you start with India now, it will be a little more difficult. So I'd like to combine these two questions.
Well, strong sustainability chapters are a prerequisite for any FTA with the EU, yeah? And our partners know it. So it's not as if, you know, we come with a sustainability chapter and then our partners say, oh, we don't want it, and we just set it aside. So that is clearly part of the discussion. And it has to be part of the discussion, as you said as well, because clearly sustainability is important to our citizens, is important to our institutions here, and we need to show and to demonstrate that trade can go on a par with further sustainability. I think that you know, this is now part of the conversation, and it's also a question for us, European Union, to demonstrate the legitimacy of what we do. If we negotiate these agreements, first of all, as I said, there is this ongoing dialogue with civil society throughout the procedure. It's much more transparent and open than it was in the faraway past. And then it's also a question for us as the European Union to show that we are listening to the concerns of our citizens. So yes, there are issues of negotiability, but honestly, you know, we are one of the biggest markets in the world. So we have this power and this leverage, which ultimately should help bring about change in our partners' countries and in the ground. And this is really the objective. That's why for me, okay, I know it's very sexy and everybody's talking about sanctions, but honestly, the objective is to make change happen on the ground. And this happens through engagement, this happens through dialogue with our partners. Also for them to understand, because there's very often an issue of making our partners aware of the importance of sustainability issues to our citizens and to our consumers. So for them, it's also a question of being able to adjust to consumer expectation. So, you know, I wouldn't be so focused on the enforcement, on the sanctions. Again, I'm going back to this all the time, but the issue of the three pillars of the openness, the assertiveness, and the sustainability, they need to be seen together. And openness will remain the key factor for me in bringing about sustainability changes in these countries.
Okay, so you said you're one of the biggest markets. You have a gigantic market power, so I would now like to go to somebody who has not that much of the market power. And I would like to ask Ms. Büchel, I mean, you mentioned that already the free trade agreement with Indonesia was only very thinly accepted by a very thin majority in Switzerland. So it's quite difficult to bring this through. At the other hand, you want to have new sustainability provisions. Maybe could you explain us by the example of Mercosur, for example, that is probably in the sustainability discussion also very, very, let's say, polarizing. How Switzerland and EFTA are trying to bring their sustainability concerns into this so that it also might be appealing to the voters at home.
Thank you. Well, we have quite a similar situation as the EU, I think. I mean, also for Switzerland and the other EFTA states, having a strong chapter on trade and sustainable development is a prerequisite for the conclusion of a free trade agreement. Is it easy to negotiate that? No, not always. It is not easy to convince a partner to have legally binding provisions on this, and then in addition to that, the possibility now for a panel of experts. So we do need a lot of convincing. We do need to do a lot of convincing with our partners to have really a good chapter. I had to smile a bit when Ms. Correa said about the power and the leverage. That's exactly what we're lacking. We do not have the power and the leverage. As Switzerland or as EFTA, we are 4 small or very small countries. So we do need to use good arguments, or rely on political willingness, or rely on the EU going before us and kind of paving our way. But I mean, so far we have concluded a number of agreements where we have included a good chapter, strong chapters on trade and sustainable development, and we will keep on working like that. But there are also partners where especially exactly that question is why we cannot make any progress in the negotiations. Mercosur is not among them. With Mercosur, we have concluded an agreement in substance a while ago. We have concluded a chapter on trade and sustainable development with our model chapter, with even some of the new provisions already in. But there, of course, it remains to be seen if that will eventually be enough once it comes to a public vote, if a referendum will be seized. That's not decided yet. But we have concluded it in substance, as I said, but there are still a few outstanding issues that we need to clarify with the Mercosur before it comes to that. Thanks.
Thank you. We have time for one last round of questions. So I'd like to take these 3. You were the first, I think, and to wrap up the discussion afterwards.
Hi, this is Clemens Kober from German Chambers of Commerce and Industry. I'd like to come back to the point you mentioned, how to convince Thailand and other countries. Given the geopolitical context, our companies face an increased pressure, for example, to move out of China, biggest trading partner, millions of jobs depending on that in Germany. And this happens in a context where we have a very high level of ambition in the EU, given regarding sustainability. You mentioned some of the measures: deforestation, TSD review, GSP review, CBAM. I could go on, taxonomy, etc. So the one questions I get from every meeting with our members is, whom can we actually trade with still? What are the countries, what are the areas we can actually still trade with, where won't be sanctions, where do we still have opportunities to trade with? And so we really lack guidance on that. And we also have the impression that this approach is not that strong from the side of the EU and from the member states. So when our president went to Japan with our chancellor, the Japanese told us very clearly they are looking at CBAM and how to retaliate. So are you actually speaking to these countries beforehand, before you go into the negotiations? How do they react, and how do you convince them so we can move forward on all the topics? I think we all share the goals to get there, but have questions on how we can actually convince others to do so. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We will take all the questions at once, I think.
Hello, good morning. My name is Philipp Lamprecht. I'm a director at ESIP, the European Center for International Political Economy. We've talked a lot about the growing importance of sustainability for FTAs, and one question mentioned also in the introduction to this event was whether FTAs are actually the correct tool for promoting these very important elements. I believe they are, but I have a question. We talked a lot about FTAs that are being negotiated, and we mentioned also future partners, but that's not the full story. We should also, in my opinion, or I would like to ask, how do you plan, talking both to the EU, Switzerland, and EFTA, to also update FTAs with existing FTA partners? Because I think that's something that is going to be very important as well. It should not be forgotten. Where do you see the main incentives of these trading partners that already, let's say also recently concluded FTAs with the EU to update, also given the element of sanctions? And what is the timeline? Thank you very much.
And the last.
Hello, good morning. My name is Pétur Gunnarsson, and I actually work here in this beautiful EFTA house. I'm working for the EFTA Secretariat as, full disclosure, I worked as the secretary for the EFTA Consultative Committee, which is civil society. So we, this committee has, been mentioned here before, or the advisory bodies, which has a formal role in the monitoring phase of the TSD provisions of EFTA free trade agreements. Ms. Correa, you mentioned the EU's approach to this with domestic advisory groups, or DAGs, as they've been called. I would love to hear a little bit more about what the experience has been, and also perhaps to EFTA colleagues. Currently, we have the method which were very well described by Karin Buschel here earlier, where there's consultations with the advisory bodies before joint committee meetings with trade partners. Whether there were any ideas or something foreseen about consultation also with civil society and maybe parliamentarians on the other side, so with trade partners, as I think is the case with the domestic advisory groups. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think the question of who is there left to trade with can be answered maybe by both. I would maybe start by Ms. Buchel to answer this also. Who is there left to trade with? And then we would give you, Ms. Correa, the last words, wrapping up these three questions, if I may. Ms. Buchel.
Thank you. Well, Switzerland has 33 free trade agreements with 43 partners, so I think we have covered already most of our most important trading partners. And we have a number of ongoing negotiations which we would like to conclude with other important trading partners. I mentioned Mercosur before, but also negotiations are ongoing with Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, India, just to name a few of the most important ones. Once we have concluded these, I think it's true that there is not that many more countries where we in the pipeline. Of course, our second most important trading partner, the US, would be interesting to have a free trade agreement. And there are a few others. But it was also mentioned before that it will be more important to update agreements. And that is also the case for Switzerland. We have done our first modernization with Turkey, which was our oldest agreement in force. We have done a complete overhaul and have established a comprehensive and modern agreement. And we are currently also in such negotiations with the SACU states, Mexico and Chile. So that will be an important element for the future. And of course, when we modernize an agreement, we also try to include or will include a chapter on trade and sustainable development.
Korea.
So who is left for us to trade with? Again, as our friends in Switzerland, we have quite a big network of FTAs in force and in place. And I think they are providing for business opportunities for our economies, and hopefully helping develop the economies of our partner countries. It is true that let's say the model of our FTAs is a very comprehensive and is a very ambitious one, but the interest is there, and I would say the interest is growing. Of course, this is linked to the current geopolitical environment we live in. But if you look even at the developments in Geneva a few weeks ago, you see that even at the multilateral level, and God knows how difficult it is to move 164 countries, that even at multilateral level, there are moves towards more sustainability. It was the first time that we had the word environment and climate change in the outcome document of the WTO. So there is a general thrust that I believe is more and more shared. Now, also looking at the question, you could also say, so how do you then adjust or modernize the existing FTAs? Let me just start by saying, in terms of rolling out the review, there are many things that we can do even without changing the text of the agreements. Like I was saying, the single entry point and the fact that we have opened the single entry point to EU DACs, for example. The fact that we have now increased the predictability of the system by adding indicative guidelines. This we can do without changing, of course, the FTAs. We can also change the way we increase the support we give to the EU DAGs. So all of these things we can do without changing the agreements. Then there are changes that can be brought in existing agreements by the FTA committees. And for example, this includes having tailor-made country-specific TSD priorities, having shared and mutually agreeable roadmaps. This can be done within an existing FTA with the agreement of both parties. This can also be the case, for example, for increasing transparency in terms of the composition of the domestic advisory groups. So all of these changes can be done, I would say, without changing the text. Of course, what requires changing the text is the whole dispute settlement and, of course, the issue of sanctions. This requires changing the text of existing agreements. So how are we going to go about them? I think for ongoing negotiations, clearly the idea is to use the new approach. So as I was anticipating, we hope that New Zealand will be the first test case for the new approach. But we have ongoing negotiations with Australia. India is just relaunched. Our negotiators are in New Delhi this week. So for all these ongoing negotiations, we will use the new approach. Then there is the issue of the concluded negotiations, which are not yet in force. And of course, you all know the ones I'm meaning. We have Chile, we have Mexico, we have Mercosur. Here, we still need to see how we go about these negotiations. In particular, Mercosur, I think, is a little bit a case apart. The sustainability is at the core of the discussion surrounding Mercosur. But what we would hope we would do for Chile and Mexico is that we would manage to preserve the agreements as they are, so the balance we have negotiated with these two countries. And then once the agreements are in force, activate the TSD review clause to have then the change brought to that chapter. So that's a little bit how we see the rollout of this new approach. Of course, with like-minded countries, well, we're talking about New Zealand, but with Japan and Korea, we honestly do not anticipate any issues surrounding the implementation of the TSD commitments, and I think it does not encroach in terms of the interest of these FTAs for these partners. In terms of our experience with the DAGs, well, it's so positive that we are strengthening the support we give to the EU DAGs financially. We are strengthening their role by opening up the single entry point and giving more visibility to that. So it's a very positive experience. And of course, the inclusive and open dialogue we have in the EU, we hope also that is happening in our partner countries with the domestic groups there. So that's a very clear priority of ours. And this is why we also want to give more transparency, for example, in terms of the composition of these groups. which of course is quite fundamental. I think I've covered the points.
I think so too. Thank you very much,
Okay. Thank you very much
for this conclusive answer. Yes, this brings our discussion to an end. I would like to thank Ms. Büchel and Ms. Correa for joining us and sharing their expertise with us. And thanks to the EFTA Secretariat for hosting us in this wonderful house. And thank you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.